Hello and welcome to Maulana Azad National Urdu University's Global Classroom. Today's lesson is meant specifically for the second year MA English students. This particular lesson is based on the compulsory paper, Paper 5, Literary Criticism and Theory, and is taken from Unit 4, Block 8. The title, as you are aware, is Postcolonial Theory. Those of you who have already read this particular paper from the self-instructional material sent to you, I am sure you have started reading straight from Aristotle's Poetics to the various blocks, and by the time you have come to block 8, I am sure you have also realized that in the later half of the 20th century, several disciplines have influenced literary criticism and theory. Disciplines like linguistics, philosophy, Marxism and psychoanalysis. One such theory that was influenced in the later half of the 20th century is postcolonial theory. And to talk to you today about postcolonial theory, we have with us Professor Syed Mujibuddin. Professor Mujibuddin is Professor of English, Department of English, Hyderabad Central University. He was also associated with the Kakatiya University. Professor Mujibuddin did his PhD from the University of Kent, UK. His areas of specialization are Indian English fiction, Shakespeare studies, Victorian literature and 20th century English literature, and of course not to forget post-colonialism. Therefore, we will now turn our attention to Professor Mujibuddin and ask him what is it that we understand by post-colonialism.
The term post-colonialism refers to the social, political, economic and cultural practices which arise in response and resistance to colonialism. It is not a naive chronological sequence which supersedes colonialism, as the name implies, but is rather an engagement with and contestation of colonialism's discourses, power structures and social hierarchies. It also assumes an inevitable connection with the mother country, the metropolitan center, that renders all cultural output emanating out of this connection, this writing back to the center, necessarily hybrid and syncretic.
Sir, will you please expand on this notion of hybridity?
The dynamic hybridity that critics like Homi Bhabha, for example, have suggested to us actually emanate from the works of Salman Rushdie, for example, whose Midnight Children is an example, a very good example of how hybridity works in post-colonial literary theory and criticism. We find here in Midnight Children, for example, that the hero, Salim Sinai, is actually a bastard son, born to actually an Englishman and a gypsy girl, but born and brought up in a Muslim family, who because he was born into that family, is actually replaces another Hindu son, the actual Muslim son who should have been there. He replaces that son, and as a matter of fact usurps that place. So, that image of usurpation that occurs in Midnight Children becomes the symbol of also the kind of hybridity that Salim Sinai actually symbolizes all through the book. So, he is not just Muslim in that sense, but also Hindu and Christian and also tribal. Okay. And this hybridity, this plurality of India is actually what is reflected in Salim Sinai's character. In fact, entire structure of the book as well, because it's Rushdie has spoken about how he has been influenced by various forms of literature. He has, for example, talked about how the Tindrum, the German novel has influenced his work. But he has also acknowledged the fact that it's the Indian storytelling form, the oral form, which has influenced his work. So, it is a lot of influences that come together on Salman Rushdie's work and and pronounce its hybridity as a matter of fact.
You have seen how the notion of hybridity works in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, and if some of you have opted for this text, you can now go ahead and apply post-colonial theory to a study of Midnight's Children. Sir, may I now ask you about some more examples of post-colonial literature?
Those literatures which have a connection with the mother country, as I have just explained, especially England. So, in this connection, most of the literature that comes to mind is from not just India, as we have seen, as we have just discussed Midnight Children, but they also come from countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These are the kind of first world countries, as a matter of fact. And then there are other countries which we can classify as third world countries, like Africa, for example, where people like Chinua Achebe and his book Classical Things Fall Apart, for example, is an example of how post-colonial literature works. And then also you have West Indies, okay, the literature coming from the West Indies, the Caribbean, people like George Lamming, Derek Walcott, and then V.S. Nepal. All of these writers are considered to be post-colonial by a book like, for example, Empire Writes Back, which in itself has faced a lot of criticism in recent times for various reasons, which I think we will come back to that when we are, looking at different questions. So, you have post-colonial literature coming from a host of range of countries, from a host of different countries, as a matter of fact, where you will find that it offers us a interesting variety of different kind of literary experiences. Okay, for example, you will find that in Canada you have a lot of literature that is actually also writing back to England, but in ways which are different from what, say, an Indian writer is writing back to the English center. Okay. So, I think these are complex questions, as a matter of fact, and you would need to perhaps look at each country and its literature to see how each country has its own specific post-colonial experience, as a matter of fact, which is reflected in its literature again. Okay.
In this context, can we also place the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood and the Australian A.D. Hope as post-colonial writers?
Of course, you could. Though I can't talk much about these writers because I don't have much reading in these areas. What I can say is that both A.D. Hope and Margaret Atwood do actually also share this hybrid urge to not just look at their own Canadian native experience, I mean quote unquote native experience, but also to write back to the center, because they, England is, so many ways much closer to the experience of these writers. Okay, not just because they are only white, but they also have very deep connections with England. Maybe not as much as India and other third world countries do, but certainly these are kind of first world relations that have always existed with the mother country, England. Okay.
Now that the concept of post-colonialism is clear, sir, will you please tell us what was the major influence on post-colonial theory and who are the major thinkers who have greatly influenced post-colonial thought?
Michel Foucault through Edward Said, Jacques Derrida through Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak appear to be the main influences on post-colonial thinking, though these critics as well as Homi Bhabha draw their inspiration from a wide range of thinkers, from Descartes to Karl Marx. All the three critics that I have just mentioned have helped shape the notion of the post-colonial as we know and discuss it today. Other early contributors to these areas are O. Menoning, who draws an important literary parallel. His book, for example, is called Prospero and Caliban. And then there is Albert Memmi, who in his The Colonizer and the Colonized actually draws parallels with the colonial experience, draws parallels between the colonial experience and the Holocaust experience, for example, which is I think very interesting in many ways, which are not many people have looked at that area. The most important of these early thinkers, of course, is Frantz Fanon, whose The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Masks are considered to be the classic works dealing with the psychology and consciousness of the self under colonialism. It might be useful to record here also that Fanon's work is also much influenced by the French psychoanalyst and thinker Jacques Lacan. Okay.
So, after having looked at Foucault's influence on post-colonial theory, sir, will you expand a little further and tell us something about Foucault's view of power and how it has helped shape post-colonial theory?
Power, according to Foucault, is the relationship between two or more entities. Within this relationship actually, entities struggle and maneuver for position and advantage. So, for instance, the capitalist owner and his factory workers confront each other in a field of power that contains both opportunities and constraints for both the parties. As Foucault himself says, that power weakens and vacillates is in fact mistaken. Power can retreat here, reorganize its forces, invest itself elsewhere, and so the battle continues. It, that is power, traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure, forms of knowledge, produces discourses. Knowledge plays an important part in these relationships. Power is a field within which certain kinds of actions are allowed, while others are not. That is, power is a term we give to a set of rules that govern our interaction with one another. But these rules and the overall game that produces them must be invented before the field of power can be constructed. Thus, knowledge has to be created before power can be exercised. Thus, knowledge in this way is linked to power. It only assumes the authority of the truth that has the power to make itself true, not necessarily the truth of knowledge in its absolute sense, but of a discursive formation sustaining a regime of truth. As Foucault himself points out, nothing has any meaning outside discourse.
So, Ngugi's Weep Not Child now has a new perspective if we place it in Foucault's view of power. Ngugi also talks about educating his native people and how thereby they can gain freedom and power for themselves. But apart from this, we are talking about post-colonial theory, and I think a study of post-colonial theory would be incomplete without referring to Edward Said and his monumental work Orientalism. Will you please tell us what is the main argument of Said's Orientalism?
Edward Said's Orientalism actually borrows the basic idea of discourse and power from Foucault. Okay. The main argument of Orientalism, as Said outlines it in his introduction to the book, is that European culture, and I quote Said here, managed and produced the Orient politically, sociologically, militarily, ideologically, scientifically and imaginatively during the post-Enlightenment period. The book also argues that European culture in fact gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self, as some sort of double that contains within itself both its positive self and the negative other.
What then, sir, is the significance of Said's work Orientalism?
The significance of Said's Orientalism cannot be overstated, as a matter of fact. In one stroke, it brought to the notice of people, both academics and otherwise, that Orientalism is not an innocent and enthusiastic discipline that is interested only in the noble pursuit of knowledge, but also that it is a blatant attempt to create a powerful tool that can help oppress an entire people and their history. For example, as Said himself has said elsewhere, European Said's book actually helps us notice that that European interest in Islam actually derived from the fear of its being monotheistic, okay, culturally and militarily a formidable competitor to Christianity. Okay. The earliest scholars of Islam, as numerous historians have shown, were medieval polemicists writing to ward off the threat of Muslim hordes and of apostasy. Okay. In one way or another, that combination of fear and hostility has persisted to the present day, both in scholarly and non-scholarly attention to a phenomenon where Islam is viewed as belonging to a part of the world, the Orient, contraposed imaginatively, geographically and historically against Europe and the West. And this has helped other critics from Japan, for example, to reassess their the knowledge that the West has created about Japan, for example, which now they are calling it the Japanese Orientalism. Okay. So, now they are studying, helped by Said's own work, looking back at how the knowledge about Japan was created, for example. Now, Chinese scholars also are interested in looking at how knowledge about China was created and produced by the West. Okay.
And coming to Indian Orientalism?
Indian Orientalism, yes. I mean, interestingly, Said also talks about Indian Orientalism in his other work, Culture and Imperialism, where he analyzes Kim in a very interesting sort of manner, where he shows that Kim, the white orphan child in India, shown to be a kind of a leader among Indians. Okay. Whereas the Indian, as represented by the Lama, is shown to be a completely ahistorical being, a person who is interested only in godliness. That is the stereotype that Orientalism has created, can be reflected, can be seen actually being at work in Rudyard Kipling's Kim.
Another writer who has influenced post-colonial theory is Gayatri Spivak. Will you please tell us the main argument of Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak?
The main argument as Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak, is that the colonized woman is doubly subjected both by patriarchy and colonial forces, and experiences a double effacement of herself and voice. Thus, for the muted native woman, the subaltern woman, as Spivak puts it, there is no space from which the subaltern sexed subject can speak. However, she rounds up the essay interestingly by pointing out that once the subaltern speaks, she does not remain a subaltern anymore. This implies that the subaltern subject has entered the discursive power relations that Foucault has outlined, and is now ready to confront both her situation and that of the oppressors, just as you pointed out happens in Ngugi's book.
And when the subaltern learns to speak and is able to voice his or her views, do things change for the subaltern for the better?
There is no guarantee of that, but certainly a consciousness of your oppressedness or of the state of oppression that you are placed in helps you to create a resistance against it. And I think that is the important part, rather than I mean, you might be better off under an oppressor for all we know, without really understanding that you have been oppressed, okay, and might even be happy with your oppressor. But then the matter of fact is then that once you start resisting this oppression, then your actual let us say life begins, because then you start thinking about the various things that have that apply to you. Then I mean it's knowledge about your own self. Okay, it's knowledge about your own individuality. It's knowledge about own self and being, as a matter of fact. But that's again a different issue altogether, which we have to talk about in a different I think lesson, as a matter of fact.
So Spivak's feminism appears to have influenced her article Can the Subaltern Speak. Can we also look at the Dalit literature, at protest literature, and see how the same issue that Spivak is talking about might be used in this case in a study of Dalit literature, protest literature in general? Oppressor, the oppressed, and within the community of the oppressed there are other communities, the women or the disadvantaged sections who are further oppressed.
That's what she is pointing out. By subaltern she means that. By subaltern, again as I have said, subalternity is a term which is first used by is a term which is used to refer to the lowest of the low army officers, a petty officer in the army, especially in the British Army. And this term is used by Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks to denote an economically poor person or class. The term in this later sense is adapted by Ranajit Guha and the Subaltern Studies group, which is started to attempt a recovery of the history that is lost in the maze of history of the powerful and privileged, especially in relation to the history of the Indian freedom struggle. Okay. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Spivak uses this term in her essay to describe the most disadvantaged, subjugated and muted of all beings, the subaltern women. Okay. An example of just such a being is to be found in Mahashweta Deva's story Stanadayini, okay, the breast giver, which is a story about how this woman lends her breast to feed the children of a particular family, and how ultimately this woman her breast becomes cancerous, and how the same woman who once actually had been a part and parcel of the family, giving milk from her breast to the children of the family, is now an outcast, is now somebody who's thrown out of the family. Spivak herself translated this story from the Bengali, and another example of subaltern movement could be the Rani of Sirmur, where Spivak is actually discussing the issue of sati. Sati, she is pointing out in this essay, could be a choice made by the woman herself, because male patriarchy doesn't allow the woman to actually choose her sati. She has to commit the sati, Indian male patriarchy. Whereas the colonial mentality is to save the woman from this kind of horrible practice. In between these two, double colonization, what is forgotten is that the woman could also exercise her choice. Okay, that's the point that she is making there, her agency, and the fact that this agency is completely effaced, the fact that her voice is completely effaced, is what makes her subaltern, because she cannot speak. Okay, so subalternity then would refer to any person, class, or group which is so thoroughly disempowered and exploited by oppressive, powerful, imperial, political or social systems that they cannot even speak for herself or themselves. Okay. So, I hope that I throw some light.
Having looked at the term subalternity and what it suggests, sir, I have a question. Do you consider Said, Spivak and Bhabha to form the holy trinity of post-colonial theory?
They would, I suppose, themselves not label themselves as post-colonial in that strictest sort of sense. If there is anybody who is post-colonial, then it would be the people who wrote Empire Writes Back. Okay, I think it was Helen Tiffin, Ashley Croft, Bill Ashcroft, and Gareth Griffiths, and somebody else, if I don't remember the name. These are the people who actually have brought the term post-colonial to the notice of people, for whatever good or bad. They write, interestingly, the post-colonial with a hyphen, whereas the post-colonial used by Spivak, I have noticed at least, is without a hyphen. So, there lies the story again, and a different story again. But nonetheless, there have been problems with a lot of problems with the notion of the post-colonial as expounded by Bill Ashcroft and others in Empire Writes Back.
So, what are the challenges that face post-colonial theory today? Is it the same as it was a little earlier when it was introduced with a bang and everybody fell for the term and fell for the theory, or have there been criticism or any other different point of view?
I don't know. I mean, whether it was Big Bang, either Big Bang theory. I don't know if it works in relation to the post-colonial theory here. But the work of Edward Said and Spivak and Homi Bhabha, for example, did excite many people. Okay, this was giving them a new direction. to write about their own experiences. For example, this was a good shorthand to write about so many issues that were concerning them, and all those people thought that they now had a way to deal with these things. But in Empire Writes Back, it's a academicizing of the term post-colonial. That book is meant for college and university study. So that was what mostly the objection is about that book. However, in recent times, the entire idea about the post-colonial theory has also come under fire from different quarters. These criticisms have stemmed from an examination of the politics of the post-colonial theory, which, as your lesson points out, has been looked at with suspicion by people like Ejaz Ahmed, Arif Derlik, Anthony Quaim and others. These critics rightly point out that most post-colonial critics live and work within a Western metropolitan academic setting, and hardly if ever are closer to realities of the world that they write about. Okay. Critics like Benita Perry question the politics of a critical theory that privileges the hybrid position, okay, that eternally writing back position, okay, as the primary form of social discourse, which here discourse is overriding for Benita Perry. The problem with post-colonial theory is that discourse covers everything. Okay, as though there is nothing else beyond discourse, in the post-colonial experience. So she implies, as actually Empire Writes Back points out, that these models that stress to inscribe the inescapability of the discourse, which constitutes the colonizer and the post-colonized, who are inevitably bound up in writing back to each other, are in fact only a sophisticated mask over the face of a continued neo-colonial domination, as he says, very strong words. Most recently, Theory's Empire, that new book that has come out, has again challenged the assumptions of post-colonial theory and claims that major figures in post-colonial theory, that is like epitomized by Spivak, Said and Bhabha, argue only through epigrammatic generalizations than through empirical evidence or strong historical grounding. In this respect, I think in the light of these challenges, post-colonial theory perhaps now is in need of overhaul. Okay. It should perhaps rethink its location in the metropolitan center, and perhaps also desist from riding its hobby horse of high theory. One of the ways that post-colonial theory could be more meaningful is suggested by Spivak's activist interventions in many issues in Bengal and other places.
We had a very enlightening talk today on post-colonial theory, starting by understanding what post-colonialism is. By looking at the notion of hybridity, we've moved on to look at the major influences on post-colonial theory. We talked about the major thinkers who have influenced post-colonial theory. We've also looked at the major contributors to post-colonial theory. We have talked about Edward Said, his monumental work and his contribution to post-colonialism. We have also looked at Gayatri Spivak and Can the Subaltern Speak. We looked at the meaning of subalternity. We have seen how Said, Spivak and Bhabha can be considered the Holy Trinity or not. Professor Mujibuddin begged to differ. We have also looked at the challenges facing post-colonial theory today. After having listened to the talk, I am sure our students of MA English are now confident enough to take on any question on post-colonial theory. I thank Professor Mujibuddin for sparing your valuable time and being with us. It was indeed a very good experience to talk to you on post-colonial theory, and we look forward to many more such sessions with you.
Thank you very much.